Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have another incredible and fascinating episode for you guys, so sit back and enjoy. So today we got a bunch of questions about the Olympics. Mark sent questions, pay-per-view sent questions, Michigan Engineer sent questions, a couple of other people sent questions. I think some other people did, I think, as well. But we'll just cover it all because there's a lot going on. There's the Team USA hockey win, the patriotism of that, Alyssa Liu, Kash Patel celebration. So we're going to get into some of that. As I've said before in some podcasts, because some people are like, are you really excited for the Olympics? And it's like, not 100%. I mean, I appreciate the Olympics. I'm glad that they exist. I respect the Olympics, but I'm not a big Olympic watcher. Some events, I mean, it's, this is incredible athletic feats that are performed, but I don't really enjoy watching it. I like the team sports. The hockey games, I do like. I was supposed to watch the Canada-USA hockey game yesterday, but I was busy recording the much looked towards Obama podcast for this week, so I was not. I didn't have time to go to it, but I would enjoy that type of stuff, but I generally aren't. I'm not really watching it, but everyone else is because it's a big public spectacle. I guess we don't have any other news going on. I mean, we do have a potential war with Iran. No questions about that so far for whatever reason, and then we've got. Another potential assassin of Trump, which people were celebrating on the right, which we'll get into later on in the podcast, as somebody has a related question about this, so I will discuss that then, and a couple other things going on. So everyone's obsessed with the Olympics because everyone's watching it. It's on TVs. If you go out to bars, if you go out anywhere, Olympics are on. So people are just going to be discussing it, and it always becomes a matter of public discussion, whether it's the celebrations, who's winning gold, the storylines there. So that's what it becomes. And it obviously, USA beating Canada in hockey usually doesn't happen. America for a long time has not been really known for being a great hockey place, is that, especially considering we have a lot more people than Canada, Sweden, Finland, some of these places that have only a fraction of our population are much better at hockey than us. Russia is, I think they're still banned from the Olympics as formal participation, so I don't even think they have a team there. Once again, I'm not closely following. They've had these they participated as individuals or something. I remember that from the Summer Olympics 2 years ago, but they're not participating. So America, that's not really our sport, but we did win the gold. It's epic. We defeated Canada, which is awesome because Canada sucks. And we are able to show off our patriotism and all that good stuff on the world stage. And so this is going to bound to have discussions. So I'll go with pay-per-views, particular question on this. Also, somebody asked about actually it was Mark who asked about the Canadian nationalism and how their whole nationalism seems to be about anti-Americanism. But pay-per-view had a specific question saying, one of the positives for us is that normies love patriotism in sports at a time when the American flag and love for the country has become more right-wing associated, and seeing this as patriotism is now politically coded, as right-coded. I think that is relatively true when it comes to this, because there have been a notable liberal and left-wing articles complaining about how the USA chants and the flag waving has upset them. They're like, this is not the time for this. And they've had a number of Olympic athletes, particularly those skiers who were going off on Trump, and then Trump attacked them, who were like, it's really difficult to represent America right now. I'm not really proud of it. Which, after that happened, there was such a backlash that they clearly have PR agents that are coaching these athletes on what to say when the cameras are there, because they're not trained in this. And so they definitely have media professionals there. And they probably all emphasize, you are talking about how much you love this country and how much you love America. Do not say anything but that. And then the hockey players who got interviewed, Jack Hughes, who actually has been supporting Pride Night and other things, unlike a lot of other hockey players. He made sure to be, I love this country. This country's awesome. I am a proud American patriot. And everyone liked that, or at least the conservatives did. So, but also people were complaining about Jack Hughes. There's a weird internet reaction to the Olympics, which we'll go into a moment. But just on the patriotism, I think the reaction towards the Olympics, that any display of patriotism, even if it's coming from a woke Kappa figure skater or a half Jewish pro Pride Night hockey player, that it's just immediately signals right coded conservative and something that's more appealing to red state America than blue state America. Because even though the average liberal is still proud of this, and I'm not saying that the average white liberal is just like, or an ordinary white liberal is that every ordinary white liberal is like, oh no, the flag, I'm disgusted by this. But there's more of a hesitation around American patriotism and more of a cringing around it due to the association with Trump, due to the association with the right, due to the association with conservatism, and they are more hesitant to embrace it. And when the public sees these type of displays, they imagine it as right coded, even if it's not, even if the person who's doing it is a liberal. And so that is a victory for the right, that patriotism is now our purview. And the left has been trying for many years to say, well, we can be patriotic too. And they really try to go after in these protests of last year when they were having the No Kings protests. They're like, please do not wave Mexican flags, wave American flags. And then they were really ostentatiously displaying the American flags. But a lot of their protesters aren't into this. Like Antifa, will rip up the flag and not wave the flag around. They're not going to be patriotic. It's more the old resistance boomers who will do this. And sometimes they fly it upside down to say, like, this is a nation in distress. But it looks anti-patriotic to ordinary Americans. So they're never really good for this. So it is a massive advantage for the right to be the side of patriotism. And this has been a long time development. I remember in 2016 when the DNC had like their first night of the convention, they had no American flags on stage. Then no one thought this like, oh, we need to do this because we need to be over the top, Americana, patriotism. As you guys will listen to in the Obama podcast later this week, Obama really went hard into like, United States of America, we're all Americans, and going in this type of liberal jingoism, but it's not really worked. And it really comes off as fake and artificial when liberals do this, because they know this, they're simply doing this to attain votes. Now, I think a lot of the voters still are patriotic. I mean, if you look at the polling, plenty of Democrats, I'm pretty sure it's probably a majority of Democrats, but fewer Democrats than Republicans are very proud to be Americans and would evince that they're patriotic. But there's key constituents within the party who are not that patriotic, who see the flag as a symbol of white supremacy, as a lot of black commentators and black figureheads have always said. People like Ta-Nehisi Coates and others say this. So it is a huge advantage for us that whenever athletes in the Olympics, regardless of their politics, are waving the flag and saying they're proud to be an American, that signals right coded. And that just is a part of the cultural development, that patriotism is something is associated with conservatism or right-wing ideas rather than it is with general Americanism or general all Americans can be participated. It's really not signaling liberal because, and even you can notice this if you're like somebody who flies an American flag outside your home, particularly in my area, that signal conservative leaning. Even though I have seen people with pride flags with the American flag, but I think that's really a way of just signaling. It's like, I work for the federal government, but I'm also a liberal. So I think that is the case. But it is a massive advantage for us to have, to be the side of patriotism. And liberals have struggled with it a lot of times. And there will be times where liberals are like, we have finally taken patriotism because right-wingers hate America because they deny that we are an idea and they deny immigration. And it doesn't really pass because when you have a left-wing protest, they're more inclined to burn the American flag or rip up the American flag are and denounce this country as racist and denounce this country as evil far more than a conservative protest or a conservative demonstration. So that's one aspect. The second aspect that we're going to talk about is everyone was eager to know for my thoughts on Kash Patel of why he's celebrating with the hockey team. One thing I have to say, I don't think this is that big of a deal, but it does show the clownishness of a lot of Trump officials. I've not been the most anti-Kash of a lot of our commentators. I find him just a clown and a funny figure. Like, I like having, his like, see you in Valhalla. It seems he's dedicating a lot of government resources to his girlfriend's security. There's even been stories about the security detail having to escort her drunk friends home from a night out in Nashville and stuff. And he's also doing these strange podcasts with his girlfriend. And he even went on Dan Bongino's podcast to talk about how great of a job they're doing. And there's just things like, this is not what an FBI director should do. But he is also doing a lot of things that we want. Like, he is prioritizing focusing on left-wing terrorism rather than right-wing extremism. He is firing a lot of these left-wing activists and agitators within the FBI ranks, people who were kneeling for Black Lives Matter and were openly anti-Trump. He's going after DEI within the agency and, going after the bad political actors. And compared to Christopher Wray and Comey, he's an improvement in what we want. Well, the issue is when it comes to his optics and, looking like a clown, like, the FBI director is not supposed to be doing podcasts. The FBI director is not supposed to be partying with the hockey players. There is a level of dignity to this. I think with another official, like, say, a senator who was a college hockey player and he came down to support them and they had a close relationship with them and they invited him in and, he's drinking with them. It's whatever. I think for other officials, and other leaders, it's not the worst thing in the world. It's a little goofy. It's a little undignified, but it's not there. But when you're the FBI director, like, first off, why are you at the Olympics? There's a lot of things going on. And it's bad optics, especially with all the things that we got going on in the country. We've got the Nancy Guthrie kidnapping that, the FBI is investigating in. It does not end. We've got a lot of crimes and potential terrorism and a lot of chaos going on in this country. And, there's anger over, the Epstein files, which I think is a little over-exaggerated. All right, not a little, it's over-exaggerated. And I'm not sure what they want the FBI to do here. But, the public isn't very happy with Kash Patel. And he should realize this, that it's necessary for him to give off that he is taking his job seriously and focused on work and not doing these podcasts and stuff. And him going smashing beers with the hockey players. I was dying laughing because I'm like, this is so idiotic. I'm like, this is there's just a lack of awareness of what he should be doing. So I found it very funny. I was not upset by it. I'm like, because I realize how stupid it is. And he just does it anyway. And I'm like, come on, man, you've got to focus on the ball here, not on the puck. But he was there, and I thought people were like, oh man, people are going to lit into him. And certainly the left and liberals did. But I started to notice that a lot of right-wingers began defending him, which is like, wow, this is the first time I've ever seen people defend Kash Patel on the right. And there's a lot of reasons to attack him. Earlier that day, I was seeing all these right-wingers attack Vivek simply for celebrating the hockey win. And they're like, get back in your locker, nerd. We're the jocks here. And we're like the hockey players. You're not. Get back in the locker. You wanted them to study for the spelling bee. We're having beers with them. So I was like, when there's already an Indian who wasn't trying to adopt their win for himself. He's simply just praising them. And, right-wing Twitter violently reacted to that. And so when I saw that there was going to be an Indian having beers with him, I was like, man, people are going to really flip out. But people were all defending him. And I began seeing more and more people defend him and like, this is normal behavior. And then they were telling the critics to get back in their lockers and to get shove it, and this is based in awesome. And I was surprised by that, but I shouldn't have been, because I realized that what had happened is that there was a reversal of the jock-nerd dialectic that dominates internet discourse. And this has been all over for Olympics. And this isn't something unique to the right. That everyone engages this online. The left is also as eager to engage in this. And the left has been attacking the right for being nerds who would never be on the hockey team, which, yeah, obviously I don't think trans leftists are super athletes either. But then they would all claim that they're just like these athletes because these particular athletes are woke, and right wingers are so weird and everyone hates them and everyone finds them repulsive. Meanwhile, the trans leftists are going out and having brews with their boys and and playing football with them or something. And so they imagine their enemies as the nerds, and right wingers like to imagine their enemies as the nerds and themselves as the jocks. And when they saw the fact that it was primarily establishment liberal reporters attacking Kash, and that this is seen as Kash is being accepted by the jocks of the hockey team, that the right realized, like, oh, I don't want to be on team nerd. I need to be on team jock. So then they all went and decided that they are with Kash Patel because they were terrified of looking like nerds, and they wanted to be on team jock, even if it's clearly not the responsibility of the FBI director to be partying with the hockey players. I mean, in another case, I mean, if it's like other officials, but it's like the FBI director, you're not supposed to do this. But our side is so frightened of being labeled as nerds and is so desiring, as every internet side is, of looking like the jocks, that they had to defend Kash Patel in this situation, to say, we're with him. This is what he should be doing as an FBI director. You're a nerd who needs to get stuffed in a locker if you think otherwise. Which I think the behavior of itself is like fine. I mean, if you're a 40-year-old FBI, I think it's more the position that you shouldn't be doing that. And I find our side is always a little eager to defend some of the clownish PR stunts, simply because of the jock-nerd dialectic. I see that a lot with some of the Hegseth's silliness that he does, that people will then just like defend it because it's like, oh, well, the nerds are upset. Us jocks are standing with him. And I even saw people who were clearly not jocks in high school, some prominent influencers who were telling people who were probably jocks in high school to get stuffed in a locker for this. But it's all about who can appeal to this. So the jock-nerd dialectic that I wrote about last year is strong as ever. And this is what made people, the online right, which would have otherwise criticizes Kash Patel nonstop, wants him fired, to have, this is like the first thing that everyone's universally praised him on, because the desire to look like a jock and be on with the side of the jocks is stronger than possibly any other motivation for our side, for a lot of people. So people were defending it as like, this is a normal thing to do. It's not a normal thing for an FBI director to do. Is it one of the greatest offenses of the admin? No. But it's just a sign that there's too much clownishness, and it's not good optics. I mean, the average Americans are going to be like, what the hell is the FBI director doing? They're not going to think like, wow, he's so cool. I want an FBI director to knock back beers with the U.S. hockey team. No, they want him to focus on his job, okay? And this is not his job. And so it was very funny, but I'm not surprised that people got into that. So Kash Patel figured out how to win over the online right, to ignore his errors and goofiness by simply signifying he's a jock, and we cannot counter or criticize any jocks that are apparent. Is we don't want to be stuffed in the locker. So got to look out for the jock-nerd dialectic as a very powerful motivation. And it's also why people hate Vivek so much. It's not simply part of it is that he's an Indian immigrant who advocated for Indian immigration, but it was also the fact that he violated the internet's core perception over that dialectic, is that he unequivocally took the side of the nerds and the jock-nerd dialectic and insulted the jocks in that X post he did advocating for H-1B visas. Is that was the real sin, and that's why people are so worked up about it to this day. I mean, there's also the immigration angle, but it's how it's presented, because several other people have done this. Elon Musk spent that whole week advocating for this stuff, and people have overlooked it. And Trump at times has said this stuff, and so has many other right-wing figures that people have just overlooked and gotten over. But the fact that Vivek put this in the jock-nerd dialectic on the side of the nerds really outraged people, because the online right, even though most people on the internet, pretty much nearly everyone on the internet involved in internet politics, would count as a nerd, they all want to pretend that they're the jocks. And to have someone take the nerd side against the jocks made that into a personal insult into how these people view themselves. So right, left, center, everyone hated that post. So but this is something that has helped Kash, is that the perception that the people who are criticizing him are nerds who hate fun, and the people partying with him are awesome jocks. The word we're exactly like, by the way, made people decide to rally behind Kash. I know there's some right-wingers who are criticizing him, but I began noticing that it shifted overnight. And Kash Patel's office is strongly defended. Like, well, we had work there. We had to meet with the Milan FBI office or something. It's like very clear he went over there to watch the game. Maybe that was the only time he came for the game, and he had some work around it. But, the optics aren't very good, and normal Americans aren't going to like that. And ordinary Americans are not as much of slaves to the jock-nerd dialectic as the internet sphere is. But on general views on Olympics, we probably shouldn't try to politicize this over the time. I think the patriotism is something that the left is politicizing themselves, where they're writing articles and having viral posts about how they don't like the patriotism being on display. You have these posts from Canadians that are just like, oh, the Canadian response to them losing the hockey game. If you ever watch them, they were like, we need to kill all Americans. They were so butthurt and just engaged in so much coping and seething and people were like, why are Americans, rubbing this in their face? It's like, Canadians deserve it. Canadians are a fake country. They have no real nationalism. They have no right-wing movement. I'm tired of pretending that we have to care about Canadians. And if you ever meet Canadians, they're all like, we wish we lived in America. So I'm not, the really Canadians who take a firm pride in their country, when they take their firm pride of their country, it's all based on anti-Americanism, because that's at the root of Canadian national identity. And it's been that case for 200 years, is that their national identity was built up on not being America, by America not being able to conquer them in either the Revolutionary War or in the War of 1812. So it was that, I think. But with the patriotism angle, it's something that the left is, when they're hesitating about this is just reflecting a lot of their intellectual biases and their discomfort around patriotism. So it signals as right coded. But a lot of other things, like, liberals were trying to adopt Alyssa Liu and some of these other athletes as like, this is proof that Americans love wokeness, is that all the people who are the best embodiments of American culture are multiracial and woke, like Bad Bunny and Alyssa Liu. And so what really makes America great is the immigrants, and everyone is wanting to make that comment. But it's just part of the course that any public spectacle is going to be politicized no matter what. And that's even the case of the Olympics. But I don't think there is much of a political angle with the actual games. It is notable that all these athletes, prior to the backlash to the skiers attacking the country, were all making similar comments like, oh yeah, we're really, because even Lou was doing this where she's like, oh yeah, I'm from immigrants, we don't like what the country's doing, I'm very uncomfortable about this, and like, I'm very uncomfortable with what my country's doing now. But then they realize that there's such a backlash into it, and they're like, stop doing that, do not anger the president. And then they went full patriotic. It was all like kind of PR statements that they realized that some of these people, probably not the Team USA organizers, but somebody was like coaching them that's like, this is what you need to say to win over the general public or something. There's a lot of times it sounded like coached statements, not the skiers, but the some of the other athletes that they interviewed were making like kind of comments that sounded like it had been written down for them. And this is like how they negotiated. But just it is what it is today. So that is my thoughts on the Olympics and Kash Patel. A lot of people asking questions about that. So it's a funny topic. But from what I was seeing more big accounts trying to defend Kash. I know that it's rather divided, but I was thinking that there was going to be overwhelming like negativity and no one defending him. But then I saw a lot of people defending him, and Jock-nerd dialectic explains that. We're now going to go to Deuteronormative. He has a question: why does the European right have such a different protest culture than the American right? And this is relating, I guess, to the protest for Quentin, where Quentin was this French nationalist who was beaten to death by Antifa. And a lot of right-wingers have been gathering, confronting Antifa and doing protests at their facilities and other things. And people were wondering, like, why don't we have this in America? And I saw a post which was saying that, Charlie Kirk's widow forgave the killer and we didn't do any of this. Well, that stuff's just not going to happen in America. And also, Tyler Robinson was not connected to a larger group. He is connected to leftism and violent extremism of that sort, but he was more of a loner radicalized. It was just him in that weird Discord chat, which they are investigating to see if they can have charges for them, and maybe they will find charges with them. But a lot of that is due to the perception on our side, the thinking that he was a trained professional, part of this grand weather underground network that doesn't exist, but we want to pretend it exists. That's happening, and that the government should have done more, but also individuals needed to do more to confront, Antifa in their own cities, which, people used to do this in the, in the 2010s with not so good results. That was like what Charlottesville was. That was what the Battle of Berkeley was. And these things were rather counterproductive and stupid. And people were doing this also in 2020 in Seattle, why do you need to do that? You want the government to do this. So do you want them to just show up? And also, we don't have enough people to do this type of stuff. Is that most of our side are middle-aged. Most of the conservative side are people who are millennials and Gen Xers. Our Zoomers that we have are not going to be doing this stuff. You can go see how our large Zoomer crowds look when you go and see the James Fish back rallies. I don't see those guys going up and violently confronting Antifa. Okay? That's not a criticism or anything. That's just saying that's what they're like. This is not going to be, street thugs. These are not skinheads. Okay? We don't have a hooligan culture here. They have a hooligan culture in Europe, which allows young men who've got a lot of violence and aggression to get that out by fighting rival soccer clubs and things like that. And both Antifa and right-wing groups pull their soldiers from that scene. And it's more acceptable for them to get in these brawls than it is here in America. When Proud Boys and Antifa brawled in New York City, I think this was 2018, the Proud Boys got sent to jail for like 4 years. So, just for fighting Antifa. So why do you want people to do this? This isn't very, you want people to go to jail for 5 years for fighting Antifa? No, that's like dumb. So I don't think it's necessary to have this in America. And we don't really have those people in America to do this. We don't have a hooligan culture. When Proud Boys tried to do it, they were all arrested and faced heavy prison time. It's like we don't really have that culture here, which semi-tolerates non-lethal fighting with people. Because one thing is that we don't have such a tolerance for brawls in America is that there's the greater potential for lethal violence. One, you got to think of a lot of people involved are magic Americans, and they'll immediately go to lethal violence, whether it's guns or knives. In Europe, it's understood that people aren't going to turn to deadly weapons. And even in this case where it happened with the Quentin, they beat him to death, but with, their own hands and feet, from what I know. and so it wasn't utilizing weapons. But here in America, people are bound to in brawls to utilize weapons, much more so in America. So it's bound to there's a greater chance of it turning lethal. And as I said, we don't have a hooligan culture. NFL fans, like, sometimes, you always see these like fat Hispanics like sometimes fight each other, but this is very different from, the ultras fighting each other in Europe. So, and people want to say that this is what they want to happen, but Tyler Robinson is likely going to get the death penalty. The guys who killed Quentin, it might be, it's not guaranteed that they get even 10 years in jail. There's even a chance that they get all very lenient sentences, very light sentences, and just say, oh, we acted in self-defense of some sort. The judges in Europe, the justice system in Europe is far more screwed up than it is in America. Even with all our problems that we have here, it's worse in Europe. Far worse in Europe. If you go and look at the news on these like migrant rapists who are getting off easily or not getting deported, and they just do their justice systems are far worse. And also they're sending right wingers to jail for a year or even longer simply for a Facebook post and for their free speech. So but people like the spectacle of it. One thing is that for a lot of our side, they want that spectacle. They want to see the flares and the flags, and it's cool. But you have to wonder, it's like we're doing something different in America. We're not going to have that in America because we don't. Most of right-wingers, as I always say, have something to lose. And they're also not based in these cities. They're generally in the suburbs and rural areas. They have to travel a lot to go to these places. They also don't know where the Antifa bar is. While these guys do, because they're in battles with them all the time. And they're also both urban-based and know these neighborhoods. You're asking guys to drive an hour out into a random city and to find the Antifa haunt, and they might not even know where the hell that is. They actually don't know where that is, actually, in fact. And you're asking guys with like jobs, kids, family to do this. And in Europe, I'm sure some of these guys do, but they have more younger people. And so a lot of our guys who don't have that stuff, because people are always like saying, oh, we now have a lot of people without kids and families and good jobs. But most of those types are rather counterproductive and useless for our side. As we can see with the guy who tried to assassinate Trump over the weekend. Like, this guy, this is what our losers do. They want to shoot our own side. There's not much difference between them and Tyler Robinson. They're either just gonna sit on the internet all day and complain and want Trump to be tried and arrested for treason or pedophilia because they're prone to schizophrenia, or they're doing drugs, and they're just like useless to our side. We can't expect them to be utilized as like shock troops or street thugs or even in that sort, which I think would be counterproductive in our country, because look at the reaction towards Charlottesville. That destroyed the alt-right. That the American public doesn't like this stuff, whether it is either Antifa or the right. It doesn't really work in our country because we don't have the social acceptance of it, where there's a greater degree of acceptance of that in Europe due to the hooligan culture. But but then they're not even going to do that. And even if these guys showed up, they have no fighting ability. They're going to like stare at their shoes and like have some weird anime shirt on and just do nothing. And then like as they're staring at their shoes, talk about how Trump's a pedophile and a traitor, and we should do something about that. And that's like what this assassin did, is that generally we hype up our own losers and they turn against our own side, don't do anything except for engage in like lone wolf terrorism that is 100% counterproductive and isn't going to do anything. So some people are like, well, we need those types, but for our side, they're all practically useless. At least in this regard. I'm not saying that if you have the type of people that Antifa has, like they're pretty good. The left is pretty good about taking their drug addicts and they're permanently unemployable and they're malcontents, and then organizing them into disrupting right-wing stuff and taking over streets. Our side, they're pretty much only good for spreading the dumbest conspiracy theories imaginable and talking about how the entire right needs to be arrested and celebrating how looking forward to Democrats having complete control of the country. So then they can rise up and take over afterwards. So I don't think you almost want to have that protest culture. But I think with the American right, we don't have a protest culture because European right, they have these, to include European right, they have these hooligans who can go out and protest and do that. And there's a degree of effectiveness. There is a swirling public backlash against the left over the Quentin murder in France and elsewhere. So there's productivity to it. But in America, we just don't do that. It's very weird to us. We tried doing this in the 2010s. It didn't work out at all. And we're focused on something else. And our side, we have a more established, middle-aged base than the European right does. And even the young guys we do, they're not hooligans. I meet these like Zoomers. Like you're not going to expect the people turning out for James Fishback, which he's getting a large young audience, to then turn into hooligans fighting minorities or Antifa or stuff. They're not going to do that. And they shouldn't do that because they're going to get they're going to get long time in jail, which is what happened to people at Charlottesville and what happened to people in like a bunch of these Proud Boys who got in fights. So that is my answer for that. Mark had another question. Thoughts on the recent cartel-fueled violence in Mexico? It's really crazy. I have to focus more on that. It is one worry we have to have is that the cartels, is that there's been this demand that we start doing these assassinations and military actions against the cartels in Mexico. In the way, if we're doing this against Venezuela and doing this in Iran, against doing this in the Middle East, why don't we do this to the people, the bad actors south of our border? The problem is that in certain areas that there's a lot of Americans like to vacation there, and then that offers them a huge supply of potential hostages to take. And they could start doing this, especially if the leaders they kill are the level-headed people, and then the hotheads take over, and then they start doing this. And there's going to be say we did kill a cartel leader, and then they took over an entire resort, and they had hundreds of American hostages, and then they threatened to kill them unless they leave them alone. And it would not be a good for America's stature to do that. So it's just something I think we should still carry out some of these strikes and go and utilize our military resources against the cartels. But we do have to realize that there are going to be consequences for that, more so than there are against our actions against terrorists in the Middle East or in Africa, or even against heads of state in Venezuela and some of these other Central American countries, that the cartels have a greater ability to strike Americans than anyone else. Now, the one fortunate thing we have about the cartels is, unlike jihadists, is that they are more rational actors because they are motivated by profit rather than religion or ideology. And for the most part, their reasonable leaders are like, do not strike America, because America, if you do that, America can rain down hell on us, more so than our own government. It's why when they briefly captured these blacks who were clearly trying to find drugs in Mexico, they thought they were Haitian smugglers, and then they realized that they're Americans. They're like, oh shit, they quickly released them and then handed over the cartel members who were believed responsible for it. They definitely are terrified, but there could be, less rational actors, more crazy people to take over with some of these people. So you have to be aware of the consequences that happen and whether the American public would accept them. But I think it is necessary to go after the cartels. We shouldn't have a narco state south of our border. We should continue the war on drugs, in my opinion. Drugs are bad. Armed Enjoyer had a question. He said, "There's a faction of the online right, with Tucker as the most prominent example, that has a pro-life humanist worldview. They're anti-death penalty, oppose U.S. nuking Japan, moralizing what's happening in Gaza, and some even say all nation states are equal and deserve to have their sovereignty respected. It seems at their core they aren't much different from the liberal international establishment. Your opinion?" I don't really see this as like a faction. I just think that they utilize these arguments because it's a sign of how powerful liberal opinions are in our society. And in order to gain influence for your own position, you have to make a lot of these arguments. And so people will appeal to that liberal humanism, even if they are right wingers. And so people just fall back on this stuff because this is what is most common in our society. And so people, even if they're anti-liberal, fall back on liberal positions. I don't know if Tucker is anti-death penalty. I wouldn't say him as the most prominent figure of this, but he sometimes makes these arguments. He even made this argument, sort of liberal internationalist argument, with his argument against Israel, where they're both arguing over who's more indigenous to the land. This is a very bad argument for Americans to make because we are not indigenous to this land. We took it over. And I really don't like utilizing that argument because it's... we took over the land. We made the country. We are indigenous to this country, to the government, because we made the government. There was no America before us. We made America. But in terms of who is indigenous to the land, Americans should not be making this argument over whether to support Israel or not. But we all fell back on this because this is what's prevalent in our society. And, it's even when conservatives say, like, oh, liberals are the real racists, it's saying that they are in violation of their own principles. So we always, and a lot of times, appeal to liberal ideas and notions to defend our cause. And it's why when people go off on Israel, they turn into Palestinian human rights advocates. Even if they're like, liberalism is a disease and we need to read Carl Schmitt. And then they're like, how dare you, bomb some Gazans or something. And you can argue that's wrong, but then they turn into, bleeding heart liberals over the matter. But it's just what happens when you live in a society where these are the most popular ideas and notions, that even the dissidents will appeal to them to defend their particular position. So I don't think that this is a particular well-formed worldview. Tucker depends on I don't see him as that, but some people will say, they'll utilize this for they'll just have particular positions and they'll find arguments to defend them. And often those arguments are liberal arguments, even if that person is an anti-liberal. So I guess one thing I do try to strive is I try to, I'm not like one of those people who are like, our main thing is being anti-liberal and anti-classical liberal. And in a lot of ways, I'm a classical liberal. But I always try to avoid like human rights talk for any type of position I'm taking, or any talk about indigenous or whatever. I think that's very counterproductive for our side and undermines our own cause. K-Max has got some questions. We got the Supreme Court ruling. Somebody else, I forgot to get to this. The Supreme Court ruling, Nitro also asked about the tariffs. Well, K-Max is asking who's my favorite justice. You're my least favorite of the conservative justices. It's definitely Amy Coney Barrett. She was touted by all the conservatives who now forget their previous avowal of her. It's like similar how they forget how they were all never Trumpers in 2016 and DeSantoids in 2023. But they were all like, Amy Coney Barrett's going to be our RBG. She is so based. Oh, look at her notepad. There's nothing on it. That's how smart she is. And I immediately knew is that she would be the least trustworthy of them. Like Roberts would in some ways be better than her, but ACB is still better than Roberts because Roberts is always trying to be Mr. Moderate and Mr. Respectable, probably more than Amy Coney Barrett. But everyone should have known that, like, the fact she cried over George Floyd with her adopted Haitian kids should have been like, yeah, no, we don't want this person on the Supreme Court. But they all went for it because it's like, we need a base Catholic mom who's an integralist, and she's not even an integralist. And even her form of Catholicism is very influenced by Pentecostalism and evangelical stuff, which a lot of Catholics are critical of. She's a charismatic Catholic, but people went along with it anyway. They love the girl boss, and all these conservative women is like, this is going to be a model for us. And I think it is an accurate model. Is that these women, like, they'll pretend to be base, but then their ideas are actually libtard. So absolutely, Amy Coney Barrett. I mean, the favorite, Clarence Thomas and Alito, probably. Equal. But in terms of Trump's best picks, it's always been a battle between Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, but I think Kavanaugh's better. Gorsuch is prone to go on wild arguments. Gorsuch is better on free speech in some other matters, but he's less trustworthy on immigration. And he also gave half of Oklahoma to the Indian. Like, he's horrible on Indian issues. There's a lot of issues where he's just like completely unreliable on, and one of the worst justices on. So it'd probably be Kavanaugh was the best that he picked. And I was a big advocate of Kavanaugh more than I was of Gorsuch and Barrett, and I was proven right. But on the tariffs that themselves, Nitro, all my thoughts on it, I mean, on paper, I don't like the Supreme Court deciding political decisions. I don't think that's what our framers intended the government for. And people were like, no, they have to weigh in because Trump is taking over from the legislative side on tariffs. For most of the 20th century, the tariffs have been taken from the legislative branch and given over to the executive branch because the legislative branch couldn't be trusted with it. Is the legislative branch, when even they were passing protectionist tariffs, they'd often be, if you go back to my IQ supplement on tariffs and trade policy, is that they'd load it up with pork barrel and set asides for their own narrow particular interests, and it would not be focused on the national interest, and it'd be this schizophrenic policy that was passed through because they had to get all these various interests on board. Now with the executive branch, it's a clearer, more coherent policy. The issue is that you can't have a president who could just set tariffs against the legislative will. But, this is a political matter. If the legislative branch wants to overturn Trump's tariffs, it's their prerogative to do it. It's not the Supreme Court that should go in. And maybe if at like a narrow basis that they went in, I don't like the Supreme Court deciding all our political issues, but they are and when I said they're the most preeminent branch, man, I didn't know that there was all these right-wing support opponents of tariffs, which I thought I was alone, but all these people were like getting extremely mad at my mentions over this. And I'm like, look, I'm fine with the decision because I think the tariffs haven't been working out, and they've been arbitrary. They need to be contained. So I actually appreciate this Supreme Court overruling them. But unfortunately, then Trump decided to pass threatening a global 15% tariff. I don't think he's going to follow through with that because all these countries are blowing up the White House phone lines about it. And he's going to be told that this is going to, force the stock market to plummet. So I think he's just going to accept the Supreme Court ruling. I think it's generally good for our interest because, I'm not a doctrinaire free marketer or free trader. I think sometimes you can have protectionism, sometimes you can have more open policies, but the way the tariffs are working is it creates too much uncertainty and instability within our economy. And we are trying to do a lot of other things in order to get people to ignore or be on board with what we're doing, such as mass deportations and other things, is that we need to have the economy being pretty good, pretty stable. People are hiring, new jobs are being created. We need that. And tariffs, we're doing the opposite. So I think, and for, our interests of mitigating the disaster of the midterms and then winning in 2028, it's better if we don't go with a radical tariff policy. And so I think the SCOTUS ruling, even though I don't like the Supreme Court deciding political matters, I need to change that. Because we have to rely on the Supreme Court and the courts to decide political matters because the legislative branch does jack shit. So actually I need to revise that. I think tariffs should be one thing that we maybe shouldn't allow. It'd be like, if they start deciding foreign policy. But we've turned to the judicial branch because the legislative branch doesn't do shit. It can't do anything. And people are like, we need to revive the legislative branch as our preeminent branch. Like, no, we absolutely shouldn't do that because if we did that, they would all be passing horrible bipartisan measures that then destroy the country. Like, look, they'd be passing amnesty. They'd be passing, Iraq war was a bipartisan measure. They probably won't support a war because wars are really unpopular with the public, and it's very tough to sell the public on that. So that's one area. But most of bipartisanship would be just a disaster. It'd be like criminal justice reform, amnesty, immigration. It's almost better to leave some of these matters in the hands of the judicial branch than it is with the legislative branch. But it is, something notable that's happening. Second question from K-Max. He said, I read in a recent poll that in experimental settings, blacks of both parties and white Democrats favor black criminals over white ones in sentencing and pardoning decisions, while white Republicans have no racial preference. This is so counter to what the left has screamed about over 30 years, that prison sentencing is biased against blacks and favors whites. New data shows exactly the opposite. Does this not surprise you? No, it doesn't surprise me at all. It's very clear. I mean, we do have systemic racism in our justice system. It's in favor of blacks. It is not in favor. It's not opposed to them. Because when you have jury pools, and a lot of black crime occurs in very heavy black areas, even black majority areas, and most of the jury pool is going to be, disproportionately black. And there are several examples of them having black jury, and then them listening to black criminal. And if he had done his crime, if the criminal had done the crime against a non-black person, the jury will be more sympathetic, or the black jurors will demand lenient treatment for them. Now, when it's black on black crime, I don't think that that's quite the case, but they are ultimately more sympathetic to them, and so it is a problem. And so that's the real systemic racism in our judicial system. It's not anti-black racism because it's like, well, they are sent to jail more. Well, that's because they commit more crime, they commit more violent crime, more serious crimes, and it's almost remarkable we send them to jail with some of the juries. But a lot of that is them making plea deals, which offers them a lighter sentence than they would if they went to court, or if they went. So yeah, no, it doesn't surprise me at all. It's 100%. It is accurate over what people are actually like. Imagine white Republicans are these closeted white nationalists who have deeply held racial views, and Republican Party is always sending out dog whistles to them to activate the racism. But in reality, they have no racial preferences. That they are truly white Republicans, probably to our, maybe not to as exactly as we want, are post-racial Americans. Is that they truly don't see race, probably more so than any other group of people in this country. Is that they are probably the real colorblind Americans, and they're colorblind to a fault, but everyone else is not colorblind, and there needs to be some readjustment to that. But I think when it comes to a criminal case, and they just weigh the facts, they weigh the evidence. And I think that's what we want in a justice system. So white Republicans are going to be, if someone is clearly guilty, they're going to find them guilty. If they're innocent, they're going to find them innocent. They're just going to stress the facts and evidence. And I think that's what we want in America. And so, you have people like Richard Hanani and other things are like, white Republicans are rejecting the Americanism and American ideals because they want immigration restriction. But in fact, they are the ones who are carrying out the promise that liberals want of America. But they're the only ones who do that, and sometimes to their own fault. So, and to their own errors, and that they are the ones who don't benefit from that. Tiberian fan asks, what are your thoughts on the upcoming 250th anniversary, and do you think it will help the GOP in the midterms? No, I don't think it will help the GOP in the midterms. People will forget about it by the midterms. I think I'm wanting to be optimistic about it. I think it'll have some cool stuff. Like there's going to be a F1 race, and there's going to be a race in D.C. That's cool. MMA fight on the White House lawn I'm not as thrilled with, but I think the base will like that. I think that's once again a little undignified, which I guess I'll be shoved in the locker by all the jocks of online right Twitter for saying that. But I think from what I remember from the Army Parade, a lot of people were critical of it, but I'm like, what else do you expect from our country? I thought the people enjoyed it. It was a nice time. I think it'll probably be something about like that with the 250th anniversary. It'll be okay. It'll be a nice time. There'll be some nice things about it. I think the people who go there will enjoy it. Will be deeply inspirational and something like certain rallies that a government put on in Central Europe in the 1930s, where it's like people were having, these like almost religious rituals, or something like what they were doing in the Soviet Union. No, it's not going to be like that. Americans would find that very weird, and there's all these diverse interests and aesthetics that with a country that you're not going to have that. But it will be a nice time, I think. Yes. Will there be some cool things with it? Yes. Will it be this deeply reverential event, this almost type of high sacred day? Probably not. You're not going to have the type of military bombast of the Soviet Union's rallies or any other type of country. And I think a lot of the right wants that, but that every American would find that weird. Even Americans found the Army Parade very weird. And it shows that we're just not good at that type of stuff. You had just like soldiers sauntering around. I thought it was cool. Like, I saw tanks and, helicopters and stuff. I was like, that's cool. But it'll probably be something of that sort. It'll be something very America, for better and for worse. I think it'll be a nice time. But I think it won't affect the midterms. It'll just, people will forget about it by the time that they're at the ballot box. And so, James has a quick question. Is like, what is your opinion of Scott Galloway? I don't really have much of an opinion. I'm not that familiar with him. So that's my opinion of him. Dollar Bill also asked a similar question about a person. Or no. He asked it, but it's a quicker question. He asked, what happened to Greta Thunberg in 2019? She was celebrated as a climate change activist, but since then, she has fallen off the radar. You've got to pay attention more to the news because she's now a Palestinian activist. She has made a ton of news for trying to help the Palestinians out, but she's moved on from climate change. I think the fact that she's no longer as focused on that indicates that it's not as big of an issue as it was 6-7 years ago, as it is today, is that other issues have taken over the left and taken over their focus. Climate change is still big in Europe, but it seems to have disappeared from American public. Like, no one's really talking about the Green New Deal anymore. I doubt Democrats are going to be really campaigning that hard on climate stuff. One, they know it's bad for the economy. Also, they have other different interests that are not that thrilled with some of these climate change prerogatives, and it seems that Green New Deal has fallen by the wayside with that. So Greta Thunberg is now relevant not for climate change stuff, but for Palestinian activism. So that is an interesting change. But she has not fallen off. She's still talked about a lot. So you got to fall. Maybe for other people that they haven't seen her as much. So it depends on where you're getting your news consumption. But I see her a lot. Maybe not as, she's not as much of a cult figure or this media astroturf figure as she was in 2019, because Palestine is obviously a more controversial issue for the mainstream media than climate change. But she's still a relevant figure. She's just now focused on something else. New England Refugee has a question. It was for the mailbag, but I'll just get it for now. He's like, following up on who do you trust more, people motivated by profit or spirit? Do you think Americans are more motivated by fear or greed? Well, they're both connected. I think fear of being poor and fear of being poor. I think it's more, and fear of being deprived of things might be the bigger motivation, but they're both connected. I don't think Americans are fear of failure. That's another thing. They're not as clear differentiating principles as you would think. They're motivated by both. But fear probably overwhelms greed. And I think the fear of being poor is why, and our fear of, living out in the street is a greater incentive for working than the mere love of money. And I think the fear of, going to jail outweighs, people turning to illegal means to make money. So I'd probably say fear on that. But it's like all people. Fear is the greatest motivation for humans. fear of death, fear of failure, fear of being poor, fear of being alone, fear of anything. These are people are motivated by fears. And so it's all usually the primary motivation for man. And Americans are no different. So, yeah, I would say it's fear on that. His other question is great article about the necessity of the Republican Party. The socially maladjusted people demanding an end to the GOP could always just organize a primary effort and win it if they wanted the GOP to change, but that would be hard and actually take effort, and these people would rather play make-believe. Are we better off without these people? They aren't that many votes, and by getting rid of them, we could attract more normal people to join the GOP instead of having them talk to people about Jews and other things at every event. Well, you're just going to have these people no matter what. I don't think they really turn off normal people because they're not that involved in real world stuff. The thing is when they always say about abandoning the GOP is that like, okay, we lost a primary race for city council in like a 10,000 person town. So now we're going to form our own third party to solve this problem. It's like, if you're incapable of winning a primary, how the hell are you going to win a third party? Because that's even far more difficult. But the thing is that they don't understand that it requires a lot of money, a lot of mass following, and a lot of organizational ability, which they all lack. But then they just pretend if we just get rid of the GOP, then it's in. But the reason why people want to get rid of the GOP is it allows them to go off into fantasy land and imagine a better world than what is the mundane facts of ordinary politics. And that's a lot more interesting, than, it's a lot more fun to imagine your politics as your own little personal RPG or real-time strategy game than to actually interact with politics as itself. And so these people are there. But it's just the nature of the internet. We're not going to get rid of them. You just want more reasonable voices to have it out there, to be more realistic about what we can accomplish and how we can change things rather than retreating to fantasy land. And retreat to fantasy, I was seeing people who were making this point as like, oh, well, actually all politics is based on fantasy. To a degree are based on idealism, but the right is uniquely fantasy based, more so than any other, the far right is than any other. How we view the world, how we view the past, how we view a lot of things. And I love fantasy, so this has appeal to me, and there is a certain appeal to it. But we have to live in the real world, and a lot of guys refuse to do so. But giving up on the GOP allows them to move to fantasy land and not have to deal with actual life, and everything can be awesome and great, and that they're the dictator and they can do whatever they want, and they don't have to bother with actual politics. But the issue is even if you're not bothering with actual politics are going to bother with you, and so you have to address the real world rather than running off to fantasy. So, who else we've got? We've got Gillis Enjoyer. Let me check on who else we've got before we go to LK Rurik. I think we've got a new guy. I got to go to him. We'll go to Gillis Enjoyer next. He said, Charles, he asked, how and why is that despite the online right's small size and oftentimes hysterical fits that the admin seems to listen to us and parrot some of our ideas if not actually implement them? Is the online right important enough for the admin to take us serious, or is it more of a coincidence when they do things we like? Well, we provide all the energy, and we also are influencing all the young guys, and a lot of we're the huge influence on intellectual conservatism now. Is that the old intellectual conservatism and the old conservative movement has been undermined. Is that people like Jonah Goldberg, the David Frenches, they've been cast out. Nobody wants the type of, Paul Ryanism that denominated before. They want something new, and what something new is provided by the online right. It's what every person involved in the conservative movement under the age of 30 and really under the age of 35 is engaged with. And so that they take these ideas, and that's what the administration thinks is the brain trust for the right now. And so really the online right, despite the small amount of people we have, and comparative our amount of people who believe in this stuff, it's far larger than before. We have done a hostile takeover of the conservative movement. Now, we have not done a hostile takeover of the GOP, but the GOP has a symbiotic relationship with the conservative movement, where it's relied on the conservative movement for its ideas, for a lot of its energy, for a lot of its activists and ideologues. It's always turned to the conservative movement. And so the online right has gained a foothold within the conservative movement. It doesn't have total control over it, but it's now a strong faction within it, and it's able to compete with others. It's why the Heritage Foundation is now taking on a lot of online right ideas. And when the Heritage Foundation and a lot of conservative media outlets like The Blaze, now the Daily Caller, I see them, despite calling me an evil loser for years, is now adopting my ideas. When all these places are adopting it, and this is where Republicans turn and people in the admin turn for news and information and ideas, that's how online right ideas get out there. So, but it's dependent to maintain that relationship. It's dependent on realizing the GOP is our only political vehicle for this, and realizing and also understanding that the conservative movement is now to the right of the base. When in 2016, we used to always argue that the base is to the right of the conservative movement. And that was true because the base embraced Trump. Meanwhile, the conservative movement was like, we've got to go with Marco Rubio. We've got to have amnesty. The base thought differently. And now the conservative movement is like, we need an authoritarian government to deport every immigrant. And the base is like, well, what about Pedro, my lawnmower? And so now the conservative movement is to the right. Parts of it, at least, to the right of the base. And that's actually a benefit, because now you have more, by controlling the conservative movement, you have more control over, or influence over, the Republican Party and the White House than you would have by just representing the base, which is rather amorphous and voiceless compared to the conservative movement. So that is my views on that. Now we'll go to Gillis Enjoyer. Gillis Enjoyer has two questions. He said, how big of a win would regime change in Cuba be? I think it would be a big win. I can already hear some of the non-interventionists, isolationists getting mad about that take, but we've been wanting to get rid of Cuba's regime for years. Their regime sucks. If we had a friendly regime there, we'd turn it into a massive tourist spot. There'd be a ton of American business investment there. It'd actually be really awesome. And you'd also really undermine Latin American leftism, because a lot of the source has been Cuba. So I think it would be awesome. It'd be a big win for America. Americans would benefit. We would all love to go to Cuba. We could get Cuban cigars. We could enjoy, and people who travel there, my parents have traveled there. They all say it's awesome. And now if it was easier to travel there, Americans would go there and benefit their economy. It'd be beneficial for Cubans. We control the immigration from there if they had a different regime and they were actually offering people a decent living. So I think it would be a big win. And it undermined Latin American leftism. 2, do you think that Netflix will cave and fire Susan Rice from their board? And if not, will the admin be able to successfully block the merger with Warner Brothers? Which one is a bigger win for us? You don't want Netflix to merge with Warner Brothers. You really don't want that, because Netflix is the most lefty tech, one of the most lefty tech platforms, and you do not want them controlling the entertainment market. They'll be controlling at least 30% of the streaming market if they do so. I don't think they're going to fire Susan Rice. I think Netflix is starting to realize that the right is going to try to block this merger no matter what, and they probably won't cave over Susan Rice. With that, but it just shows that how more left wing they are. But when you look at their children's program, when you look at their overall program, it's still very woke, and you don't want them controlling a greater slice of the entertainment market. And also, it's less consumer built, because they'll put out some woke TV show and they're like, oh, we've got massive views for it. It's less beholden to actual market forces than other traditional movie going and traditional cable networks of whether they determine what's a successful show. They can really astroturf interest in a show, no matter how woke it is, and they'll put it out there. So we definitely want the merger to not happen. So we'll now conclude with LK Rurik. LK Rurik has one question. He said, imagine if you were unemployed, broke, and homeless, and some wealthy man decided to charitably gift you $1 million. Then, when you were back on your feet, you condemn that man at every turn because he didn't give you $1 billion. And say your ex-wife, who seized all your assets to begin with, was the real hero here. That's the anti-right Trump in a nutshell. Is it even possible to correct this level of pathological ingratitude? No. Ingratitude is an inability to work. Well, the ingratitude is part of the disagreeableness and the inability to work with people. That is inherent to many of the individuals that are part of the online right. Is that we have prickly, disagreeable people. And they disagree, and they're autistic, and also a lot of losers and misfits are just incapable of gratitude. Is that generally normally socially adjusted people realize, like, okay, this person's done something for me, I'm going to be on good terms with them even if they do something stupid. They are able to reflect interpersonal loyalty, but social misfits can't do that. And we witness that on a daily basis with that. But yes, that's a good way of describing the online right. Our relationship with Trump. And actually, yes, the ex-wife the left is our hero. Yes, that is a great way of summarizing it. But no, it's not possible to correct that pathological ingratitude. But if you have just pathological ingratitude, you're never going to achieve anything politically, because politics is about making friends and influencing people. And if you are known as a person who loves stabbing people in the back and helping the enemy because of your own antisocial behavior, of your own extreme disagreeableness, then no one's going to work with you. And that's something that the online right needs to realize. So if we're always having pathological ingratitude and now trying to celebrate the assassin, the wannabe Trump assassin, then why are people could eventually just tune us out and we have no political influence. Despite, our influence over young guys, young conservatives, is that if we just make the GOP lose and are eager to support whoever the Democrats have because we are driven primarily by the desire to spite our own side, why are people going to work with us? So that is a great way of framing the online right's relationship with Trump. So congrats on that, LK Rurik. So that is it for this Highly Respected. We are going to be back with more great content. We're going to have the Obama podcast for the IQ Supplement this Friday. Articles and mailbag, normal schedule. So be on the lookout for that. So until next time, stay respected.